who had been facing, still is really facing controversy in Canada about her speaking out about the what's proving to be a bogus narrative of unmarked and mass graves of children in Canadian residential Indigenous schools, and she's been facing a lot of fire over that. But our guest today illustrates that this is not just a contemporary problem or extending to contemporary issues in science. It also extends to the scientific study of past humans, that is, in the fields of anthropology and archaeology. And our guest today has faced a similar campaign of cancellation, intimidation, and harassment over the scientific study of Native American remains from several hundred to several thousand years old. Before I introduce our guest today, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping details. The principal purpose of this webinar, of course, is to give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask questions of our guest. We'll be having a conversation between ourselves for about 45 minutes or so, and after that, we're going to open the floor to questions. And I'd like to encourage you to add your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I will just emphasize that you don't have to wait for our Q&A session to begin to post your questions. You can actually post them anytime. Okay, on with the show. Our guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, professor of anthropology at San Jose State University in California. She's a physical anthropologist. She focuses on using osteology as a research tool, that is, applying the science of bones to studying human evolution and forensics. She uses a number of tools, including CT scans, X-rays, and quantitative measures on remains of past populations so that she can better understand their lifestyles and the biology from their skeletons. She's the author of several interesting books on the subject of anthropology, including politics, including Repatriation and Erasing the Past. That's from the University of Florida Press in 2020. And this takes a critical look at how repatriation laws are affected by the ideology of the people proposing those laws. She's also the author of Reading the Bones, Activity, Biology, and Culture from the University of Florida Press, again in 2017, and Paleopathology and Perspective, Bone Health and Disease Through Time from Roman and Littlefield, and that was published in 2014. By all rights, and as you can tell from the titles, her work should be pristinely scientific. However, recently, under pressure from Native American activists, she is still mired in controversy. Despite being the curator in charge of San Jose State's bones collection, she was actually barred from access to her museum specimens and eventually was removed as from her position as curator of that collection, a post that she'd held for nearly 20 years. She's since left San Jose State University, but she remains active in the field of human anthropology. She will be at San Jose State until the end of the 2023-2024 academic year. Leaving San Jose State didn't end the controversy swirling around her, however. Just the past few days, a panel that she was scheduled to participate in at the annual joint meeting of the American Anthropological Association and the Canadian Anthropology Association on Why Sex Matters in the Quantitative Study of Human Remains. A few days before this panel was to take place, she received a letter from the head of the American Anthropological Association canceling the panel because, to paraphrase from that letter, the topic of the panel was not consistent with the values of the association and would make the attendees feel unsafe, which of course inadvertently makes an important point. Whatever the values of the American Anthropological Association might be, scholarly inquiry does not seem to be among them. Okay, Elizabeth, without introduction, Elizabeth Weiss is here with us today to discuss the topic of can we save archaeology, to which we might add the question, can we save anthropology? So Elizabeth, welcome to Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So this controversy at this annual joint meeting of the Anthropological Association, American Anthropological Association, that's blown up the news recently, and it's attracted the attention of a lot of people. I wonder if you might just take us through the history of the panel and some of the events behind the cancellation of that panel.
Absolutely. So basically, the panel was created or formed by Kathleen Lowry, who is a cultural anthropologist in University of Alberta. And I had published a short letter in Anthropology News with her as lead author, about the importance of certain concepts in anthropology that we shouldn't throw out, including the concept of biological sex as a variable to test hypotheses. And so basically, what Kathleen Lowry did was she brought together a group of anthropologists who are concerned about the erasure of biological sex and mainly binary biological sex, male-female differences, as a component for research in anthropology. And so the other speakers had very different topics than I did. The cultural anthropology topics such as concerns about the sex difference in success in AI, for example, or in technology, the possible exploitative nature of surrogacy. And so one of the interesting things was, I think that had this panel been allowed to meet, we would have disagreed with each other on all sorts of things, but we were unified in the concept that biological sex is fact and is an important concept to use in research. My own abstract highlighted the skeletal study of remains in hopes to identify individuals, let's say in forensic settings, individuals who are found only as skeletal remains, but also as a variable that is used to try to understand the past. For example, rates of iron deficiency, when osteoporosis or bone loss occurs in different populations, infanticide patterns, all of questions which require the use of the biological concept, of male, female, the binary biologic. I think that you can argue that, some research questions require also to look at gender. And one of the things that I had planned to end with in my talk was that I was planned to end with the recent research that forensic anthropologists are undertaking to try to look at whether they can identify when a person undergoes like medical intervention for sex change. So like feminization surgery of the face, does that leave marks on the bones that we can use to determine, yes, this was a biological male, but was transgendered, right? So in that sense, I was not saying, oh, we don't want the topic of gender at all in anthropology, just that it's important to keep biological sex, and then sometimes it will be important to look at gender. I don't believe that you can draw conclusions about gender in pre-medical societies. I think that it's kind of insulting when people find skeletal remains and it's a female skeleton, for example, of somebody in the past, and it has tools that are associated with males to say, oh, that's because this was a transgender individual, or vice versa. And I give the example of if you find a skeleton that's a male, that's clearly a male skeleton, and we can tell this if we have a well-preserved skeleton, we can tell it within like 99%, right? So we're very good at it. And yes, we're not 100%, but that's also because of researcher inadequacy. And also then, things are never 100% well preserved. But if you find a skeleton that is clearly male, and it's found with needles, sewing needles, the conclusion shouldn't be that, oh, maybe this was a transgender individual. The conclusion should be that this is a male that might have sewn. We call them tailors. We call the female seamstresses in our language, right? And so it's kind of this regressive step that instead of thinking that males can do various things and females can do various things, that it has to be transgender individual from 5,000 years ago or so. I think this is a really backward way of looking at skeletal remains. The other thing is that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I think the other thing is that there's this kind of concept that, oh, sex is not binary because of, if you look at disorders of sexual disorders, but that's it's kind of a straw man paper dragon argument, because in a sense, we wouldn't say, oh, the normal human hand has anywhere from 1 digit to 6 digits, because some people have the pathology of having an extra finger, which we call polydactyly. Pathologies do arise. That doesn't make the binary false. And so what ended up happening is we had this panel reviewed and accepted, and we got our acceptance in July. And then 2-3 days ago, we heard that they're retracting the acceptance. We had a very short 2-paragraph letter about the harm it would cause. And the second letter that was provided to journalists and is now up on their website, their official letter, further goes on to talk about harm and compares our view, and very specifically attacking my abstract specifically, although the whole panel was rejected or canceled, I should say. Their examples of why it's problematic all are quite heavily on my abstract, and comparing it to the race sciences of the 19th century and so forth. Well, it's just untrue, and it's just an anti-science view that you cannot draw the conclusion that individuals were male and female. So far, we personally have not heard from the AAA or the Canadian Anthropology Society. We will see what happens. I have no doubt that they won't. I have no doubt that they will stick to their guns, right? So that they're not going to change their mind. And in some ways, I think that although it's always nasty to be canceled and especially in this sense where they kind of attack our scientific integrity for no reason. And in some ways, I think that, it's good that this topic is being brought to other people's attention now, because I think that oftentimes you think that basically, oh, well, the problems in anthropology or academia are exaggerated, and they're not.
Yeah, you raised a really interesting point, and I think it's related to the involvement of transgender activists in a big way compared to what you were going through at San Jose State. I think there were mainly Native American activists who were objecting to what you were doing. But your example of finding sewing equipment in the hands of someone who could be either male or female, the obvious and simplest response, of course, would be to say, as you said, men can be tailors and women can be seamstresses. But when you look at some of the more egregious things about transgender athletes or transgender people, it's in sports. And when you allow males to actually compete against women, and a number of other things, the election of a man, transgender man, I'm not sure which way it actually goes, as homecoming queens and beauty queens and things like that. it's almost sending the message that, well, these men are better women than you are, and it's very much the erasure of women. Whereas the kind of thing that you're mentioning, it actually highlights the agency of individuals in a way that is not respected by those kinds of simple boxes, and it's actually much richer and much more diverse, and all that, compared to this kind of, well, let's put you in this box and this box, and we're not allowed to stray out of it. So in your interaction with these people, have you noticed, for example, or can you give examples of this kind of dogmatic building of barriers that really have no place in the kind of intellectual endeavor that we call anthropology or archaeology?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this kind of identity politics play out multiple times in anthropology, both in the in the university and in conference settings. This kind of concept that, if you look at the Native American topics, oftentimes there's the argument that that only Native Americans should study Native American skeletal remains, is one of these same kinds of arguments. Or another perspective of that is that even if you're not Native American and a Native American disagrees with you, you should defer to the Native American when it comes to Native American anthropological studies on skeletal remains that are Native American. I think that one of the reasons why identity politics has gone so off the rail in some ways with the transgender issue and also in Native American issue is that there are people who game this system, who see that there is a benefit to being Native American, for example, and therefore pretend to be. And there are people who see that there'd be a benefit to being female and are not female, they're male, and therefore they pretend to be female, such as the athletes. I don't know how much of it is, well, I wasn't that good of a male athlete. Maybe I'll give it a shot in the female league, right? And the easy way to resolve that issue when it comes to academia, I don't think it's as easy in sports, and I'll talk about that in a second, but the easy way to solve it in academia is to judge people on merit and not judge them on identity. And I would go beyond just like with the pretendians, people who pretend to be Indians, but I would say even where we see this, big gaps in male and females in the science, in certain sciences, or especially the hard sciences, that's okay. As long as you're judging people by merit, then it shouldn't be an issue. If there's 80% of mathematicians are male without affirmative action, I don't see that that's an issue. And so I personally think that the only way to resolve these kinds of issues with the people who are pretending to be something they're not, or giving deference to bad ideas just because of an identity, is to judge people on their merit of their ideas.
Yeah. Of course, the argument back when you're talking about merit is oh, well, that's your definition of merit, and then you start getting into all these kinds of issues about objectivity being part of white Western patriarchy and all those kinds of things, where, if you look especially at the history of mathematics, for example, it's about one of the most multicultural disciplines taken over a scale of centuries that you could find. You have Egyptian, Arabic, Indian, East Asian Indian, South Asian Indians, as well as Europeans coming into this. And the result is mathematics, but it's built around not identity, but this kind of central idea that logic is a different way thinking about it. But if you look at the kinds of arguments that are being made by Native American advocates, and this is particularly the case I've seen in New Zealand, where this kind of Maori way of knowledge has been enshrined as kind of an official thing that scientists must take into account. Okay, that feeds into the whole diversity of thought thing. I understand that, but and I can see some value in consulting people who've been immersed in a culture or an environment for centuries, but mainly as natural history. Bringing in, oh well, this is a particularly bad spot to put your canoe, or whales typically migrate through this particular passage. But there's no way that trumps the Navier-Stokes equations when you're trying to understand flooding and waves and all these kinds of things. So when you encounter Native American activists who say that, no, you as a white woman should not be allowed to study Native American remains, what are the kinds of things that they bring in that are of scientific relevance? How do they see that that's going to enrich the science of anthropology?
Well, I think that there are some Native Americans, obviously, who are trained as anthropologists and who are using the same methods that I would do. But I think that there's a whole another branch that are activists, Native American anthropology activists, and they will bring in tales of creation myths, spirits. Certain places are sacred or dangerous, spiritually dangerous. We can't excavate here because that's spiritually dangerous type of arguments. And, one of the things I think that this tells is that they're not bringing in science. And it's even worse because you cannot say, well, okay, if you're bringing in something that I'm not quite sure works, let's test it. Because the answer is you are not allowed to test it. You have to defer. So I have no problem with knowledge coming from all sources as long as you can as long as you can test it and see if it works. And that is what is now taboo. And I think that is problematic. In early anthropology, when, for example, some of the early anthropologists were collecting skeletal remains of the Inuit, the Aleut. There were actually Native Americans who were helping them and who were saying, oh yeah, here's a collection, from past people, and showing them where to excavate and excavating with them. So I do think that in some ways, some of this movement is newer than we think. Yes, okay, NAGPRA is now 30 years old, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, but it's not 130 years old, right? And I think that that's one of the issues, is that this is a fairly new phenomena, and it's getting worse, not better, because the direction that these laws seem to take is that they become more and more about deference, more and more about feelings, and less about science. So some of the changes that they want to bring in some of the reburial and repatriation laws is that prior terms like culturally affiliated, so bringing one Native American, tying a Native American tribe to the remains, those terms used to be determined in large part by the scientists first, whether those scientists were white or Native American, but by the scientists. And now they want to flip it and say, they will make that decision first, and then you can put your scientific 2 cents in worth. And if it doesn't agree with us, we're not going to pay attention to it anyway. And the other thing that they want to do in these reburial laws is they want to get rid of the term culturally unaffiliated or unidentified, because they want to say everything is identifiable to a modern tribe, so that it's everything back. And there's even a movement called the Everything Back movement. And it's not just about skeletal remains and artifacts, but they want the x-rays, the photos, the digital data, and the casts. So you think, oh, okay, we'll give back the affiliated remains. We'll still have unaffiliated remains. That's not far enough. We'll give back the remains, but we'll keep the casts. That's not far enough. It's always moving the goalpost, in part because their goal is not to understand their past. And I say them as in repatriation activists, but rather their goal is to continue on this road of repatriation. And of course, they don't want it to end because then they'll be out of a job, right? And there are other reasons, but that's definitely one of them.
Yeah. Just like the toppling statues movement, the idea is actually not to, well, the idea basically is to erase the past so that theirs is the only narrative that can be allowed in the public square, and that's a very, very troubling development. Let me just mention quickly that questions are coming in. Thank you. We'll get to those momentarily, but I did want to mention that in the chat box, I've put in a number of links to websites relevant to what Elizabeth is talking about, including links to the letter that she was mentioning from the American Anthropological Association as well. Okay, so again, I'm left wondering if do people who are arguing that we should put things back, or is this a rejection of science altogether on their part?
I think it is. I don't think they would say that, but I do think that that's what it is. And part arguments of spirituality, acts of sage burning. In the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act meetings, so NAGPRA meetings, they start and end with a prayer. I do think that this is a lot of it is anti-science movement. I think that even with this latest, the latest troubles with the transgender issue, it's like it's not about the science of male-female biology, but about how people feel. And it's very much a belief system. I think that the trans movement has a huge component of a belief system aspect. And that's not to say that I don't think that there are people who genuinely think that they are in the wrong body. And there may be some genetic aspects to it. I don't know. But how the activist movement is anti-scientific. So, they don't want questions. Questions are harmful. And it's kind of interesting that many of the people who have complained about me in regards to the Native American issue are the same people who are complaining about me now. So there is a great overlap. And I don't think that this really struck me until I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past, that because when I wrote that with my co-author, Jim Springer, we're talking, we put it out and we have it. The introduction explains the postmodern ideology that favors victims' narratives over scientific evidence, and claim that a repatriation ideology is a postmodern ideology where the victims are the Native Americans who are activists, and their narrative trumps any science. And so I think that it's interesting that when we were attacked, a lot of the attack came from accusations of not of necessarily only being anti-Indigenous, but being, anti, basically being racist or eugenicist. And I just didn't see those links beforehand. And I think that this is all quite intertwined. I think we lost our our host. So I'll continue talking since we don't want too much dead air. But I also think that in some ways, the lack of scientific rigor is sometimes a result of people who go into the field not because they want to understand the past, but because they're going in for other purposes, activist purposes sometimes. And there's a huge movement, I think, to study oneself. And so anthropology becomes not the study of the other, which is what I think much of it used to be, but a study of oneself. And that's another part of this problem. We talked a little bit about basically some of the Native American issues from the past, but last week, Frances Widdowson was talking about the residential Indian schools, and she and I are working on a paper about the residential Indian school burials. And I think it's interesting that although sorry, I had to comment. I think it's interesting that basically what you have is, again, this denial of evidence. So what they do with the residential Indian schools, they're looking for children's graves, unmarked or clandestine graves that suggest not just that children died at these residential Indian schools, which is known that, I mean, children died in non-Indian residential schools too, but rather that they died for some nefarious reason, that they were murdered or treated so badly that it was a manslaughter type of thing, and then buried in these clandestine graves. And in order to prove that, anthropologists have been using GPR, so ground penetrating radar, to resolve this. But ground penetrating radar doesn't tell you what's underneath the ground. It just tells you that there is some kind of disturbance, some soil disturbance. And to actually determine whether there are children buried under that ground, you have to do the excavation. When there has been a couple of excavations, and they found no children bones. This should be a joyous occasion. No children were murdered, but it's not for them, because they see it as, we have to continue on this victim narrative.
I apologize. My computer had a little bit of a meltdown, so I see that I missed about the last 5 minutes of what you were saying. So I beg your pardon, and I apologize to everyone else for that. Okay, so where are we now? Okay, so what was the question that you were answering there, Elizabeth?
I don't remember, but I went into the residential Indian schools and about how the data of GPR is not evidence. The evidence would be excavation.
Okay.
So that's where I left off.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for filling in like that. So, all right. So, but when you, I think I sort of edged up to this question. Is it when people argue that Native American remains, including everything else, should be just swept off the table? What is their conception of knowledge about the past then? Is it just something that is handed down by oral tradition? Do they have a respect for knowledge of the past? I'm struggling to understand the motivation.
The main thing is, I think, oral tradition, oral history. I think that, passing down tales, passing down history is useful to a certain extent, but it doesn't extend past. I would say, if I'm being generous, it doesn't go past 500 years, and that's generous. One of the problems is when you define a group of people as knowledge keepers or the wise elderly, and they're telling these tales, and then the science can negate those tales by showing evidence that those tales are not true. Then what do? You don't tell the knowledge keepers that they are wrong. You tell the scientists that they have to be quiet. And that's what's happening, is basically we're being told not to disagree with the knowledge keepers. One of the interesting things about the proposed changes to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is they have a statement in there that they're going to have a new term, and I can't remember exactly because they fluctuate between what term they want to use, but it's like traditional Native American knowledge. And when I think of tradition, I think of something that's passed down from one generation to another. But they say in their definition that it does not have to be passed down from one generation to another. It's basically anything that the defined knowledge keeper says. And so basically you're giving them a platform just to make up things. And those things are not necessarily going to be wedded to any evidence. And if they want to protect their tales, they will, and know that evidence can, tell that their tales are not true, they will want to cover up the evidence. And I think that that's what we're seeing in the repatriation controversy, is that scientists are the ones who are supposed to be silent and defer to these knowledge keepers, who are really just telling. If they were from my background, we'd say old wives' tales, or fairy tales, but when it's coming from a non-Western source, it is portrayed as some infinite wisdom.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, when you were embroiled in your controversies at San Jose State, there was obviously a role that Native American activists played in this, and you got no support from your administration from the sounds of it. You were sort of left out there hanging, but what kinds of support did you get from your colleagues there?
My colleagues there? Yeah. Practically nothing. Several of my colleagues actively worked against me. I would say in my department, there was maybe one or two people who were neutral, and maybe one person who was quietly supportive. And it's a small department. The rest were completely against my position, and actively working against me. So I remember one of the, and I have to laugh because it was so absurd. So one of the meetings we had was that I was trying to get access to a Carthage collection, not Native American at all, Carthage, Tunisia, right? Yeah. And it took me 10 months to get that access. And one of the reasons why they wanted to keep it away from me is they were trying to figure out ways to legitimately keep it away from me, or I won't even say legitimately, regulatorily keep it away from me. So they went to the IRB and tried to see if they could do something there. They thought about reaching out to international groups about repatriation, and so they were actively looking for ways to say, no, you cannot have these Carthage remains. They even asked the Native Americans if these remains were related to them. And I'm sure that if the Native Americans had thought about it and knew they would be able to get away with it, they would have said yes. But one of the things is that one of the meetings, so then they decided I could not have access to the remains until we worked on a protocol for photography, to photographing bones. And I would not let that happen. I just said, I just fought tooth and nail to prevent that. And I was successful in getting it derailing their efforts to do that. But there were so many ridiculous statements in that meeting that occurred. For example, one person said that photographs of skeletal remains shouldn't be allowed because even if they're not of Native American ancestry, because if a Native American sees a photo of a bone, and even if they know it's not related, it still might upset them. So that was one argument. Another argument was that I did not have written consent from these individuals. From these individuals who lived in the 6th century, before photographs were even a thing. And I don't think that my colleague who suggested this was dumb. She was just being malicious and wanted to derail my efforts. And so I think that I did not, to put it mildly, I did not have support.
Well, I mean, that's really the dismaying thing throughout science these days, isn't it? You know, the people who are actually adhering to these kinds of intellectual imperatives that go along with science, they're just totally out there on a limb. And can you differentiate between the responses from your older colleagues who might have been more steeped in this tradition versus the newer ones who have come up through this woke ecosystem?
A lot of my a lot of the anthropologists who I know who are from the last generation of academics are actually very concerned about the repatriation issue, also about trans issue. I think that there initially, when the reburial laws were passed, there was a lot of debate about whether there could be a compromise, and the anthropologists who worked on it, 30 years ago, thought that they had reached a good compromise, and so it wasn't like they thought this was going to be the end of collections, but they were wrong. Some people saw that this was going to happen early on and warned about repatriation even from the beginning. Jeffrey Clark from Arizona State University wrote a famous article called "Nagpur and the Demon Haunted World." So there were concerns from the get-go, but even the people I know who are of another generation who are for repatriation, who are concerned about culturally affiliated remains being housed and keeping those from Native American remains, Native American tribes, took a much more practical approach and much more rooted in the compromise issue and so forth, as opposed to these really far off ideas about burning X-rays and not allowing the photographs of the boxes that hold the remains. That was another one. So I mean, these are kind of like, so it's almost it sounds like satire, right? So I do think that this is a generational difference. In part, sometimes I wonder, if I started out now, would I be an anthropologist? And I love anthropology. I love skeletal anatomy. I just think it's beautiful, but it's also really informative. There's something very enriching about learning about people who couldn't leave a written record, and that the field itself is a beautiful field, and that's why I want to save it. But if I had been coming into the university system now, I don't think I'd be an anthropologist, because I just think I would be so turned off by a lot of this stuff.
That raises a related question, of course. Do you think there's any salvation for the science of anthropology in the universities, or do we have to kind of strike out like those Irish monks to our own little enclaves to try to keep the tiny flame burning until the sun comes up again?
It's hard to say. I would hope that there's a way to save anthropology from not only, you know, the erasure of biological sex. I recently saw an article about how did they put it? That we should not dehumanize skeletal remains.
Mm-hmm.
That these are not just bones; they're people.
Yeah.
And you know, of course, all the repatriation issue, which has just gone off the rails with Native American activists claiming things like 17th century Spanish breastplates for repatriation. I can't necessarily see a way forward. And yet I'm still like, I still want to put in the good fight to try to save collections. I do think it's worth trying to save. And the other place where you'd find skeletal collections are museums, but they have many of the same issues.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another aspect. They are not immune to NAGPRA. And one of the scary things I saw when I was researching some of my latest work on the NAGPRA changes is that so NAGPRA applies to federally funded institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they want to do is they want to expand that to non-federally funded institutions, which is very difficult, but they think they found a loophole, and that loophole is any museum, private university that took COVID monies. So, you know, a lot of small museums that might have very nice artifact collections, you know, might have the big government, NAGPRA, knocking on their door saying, you took this COVID money and now we want you to list your collection, show it to the local tribes, and you might lose it. This is a terrible thing if it happens. And they are talking about trying to figure out whether this would constitute federal funding.
Yeah, and of course that's a common theme. You know, the money comes in and everyone likes the grants, but then they don't realize that there are actually strings attached to it. And very, very sobering. I don't want to say depressing yet, but very sobering. And I think it highlights the issues that we're all facing. So let's turn to some of the questions. They've been streaming in here, and I'd like to just mention to everyone, when I had to switch computers, I lost a number of the questions. So I'll try to get to all of them, but if it looks like I'm not getting there, please repost your question. And so let's turn to the Q&A. First out of the blocks is Jack Budney. He mentions, and I think you might have mentioned this already, Elizabeth, that the issue of children in the residential schools, he characterizes the issue as a fear of falsification. And he asks, would you agree? And of course, that raises the related question, to what extent, or can you give some examples of how your approach has falsified some claims about the history or culture of Native Americans?
I do think it's a fear of falsification. I don't know how much of it is a genuine fear of falsification, or they know that they have stated their evidence. This is the same thing in some ways of the concern about let's say Paleo-Indians, which are 7,500 years or older. And when there's a rush to rebury these remains, because I think there's a fear of falsification that these Native Americans, these earliest Native Americans, may not be related to the later Native Americans, and therefore this falsifying the tale that they were the first ones here. So I think that that's a very a large concern. One of my last studies that I did on the collection at San Jose State looked at biological continuity of the large collection called the Ryan Mound. And it's interesting that previously I had thought that it was a biologically continuous one population, so over 2,500 years. And I, in the past, a couple people who had come to study the collection for other reasons had questioned that. And so I ended up doing a study looking at non-metric cranial and postcranial traits, and to see if there was evidence for more than one population. And there was the oldest population is different from the more recent ones. And I think that this study wasn't done earlier because there was a fear that the Native Americans that are now in the Bay Area, the Moakma Ohlone, for example, are not related to the whole collection, and they want to rebury that collection. I don't think that they are related to that collection, at least not to the oldest part of it, but maybe not even to, the middle part of it. And so this would then throw up in the air the reburial of that collection. So fear of falsification I do think it is a concern.
Yeah, especially when it's tied into history. Well, again, tales of history of local people there. We see the same kind of thing with the Iroquois Confederacy tribes up here in upstate New York. There's this narrative, and the only things that justify the narrative, as peacekeepers and oath keepers and all those kinds of things. But of course, it ignores the fact that the Iroquois are here because they are themselves the object of a history of conquest of local tribes, and that's not something that people like to get into. Okay, so back to the Q&A. Peter McCullough is the next up. He quotes from the Anthropological Association's Code of Ethics, Section 4 specifically, where you are obliged to weigh competing ethical considerations due to collaborators and affected parties, and he lists that. He says that basically when these things arise, people need to make a conscientious effort to make sure that these things are resolved and handled ethically. Fair enough. And he asked, would you comment on the conduct of the organizers to cancel the panel you were on without consultation with you or the members of the panel?
I think that when they say that, to consider the different stakeholders, they definitely are leaving some groups out. I was surprised that they hadn't reached out to us about any concerns, usually the normal, business of this would be, we see that your panel is doing this. Have you thought about adding one person who disagrees with you? And I'm sure I would have been fine with that. Or there was like a issue surrounding the fact that I used the term sex identification instead of sex estimation. And I used sex identification, sex determination, and sex estimation are all used in the field. And I use the term sex identification because I think that estimation usually in most people's mind is related to numbers. So like you estimate the age of somebody. But it's false to say that the reason why we use the term sex estimation is because sex is not a binary. We use that term because sometimes we can't draw the conclusion. The data is not well enough preserved. Some individuals, their traits are going to be less obvious than others. There's going to be researcher error. So that's why it's not 100%, but it's pretty damn close. And so I think that turning this like, oh, well, it's probabilistic, it's, you know, goes from probable female, not being able to determine probable male to male. That's not because those are the genders or the sexes. That's just because of the method and not being able to always 100% say this is definitely my conclusion. So but I think it was shameful how they acted. I think that they did break their own code, their own principles, and that for that part of their principles, but also on others.
Has anyone volunteered to mount a letter writing campaign to the leadership of those two associations to kind of shame them into this disgraceful stand that they've taken?
I saw that FIRE has put out a letter. I saw that right before I logged on. So FIRE has put out a letter.
Okay, excellent. All right. So have they given you any feedback as to how that's attracting anyone?
No, and I literally saw it like 5 minutes before I came on. So I don't know, you know, how many people have signed it, but you can sign it. And if you, I don't know, I don't have the link on hand, but I can provide the link. I'm sure that somebody in the audience has the link too. Yeah, so I think that will help. But I was surprised that even after they got a lot of the backlash, their second letter, the AAA's second letter, doubled down. You know, they didn't ease up, they doubled down on it. And so I don't think it's going to have much effect.
Yeah. I see that Marcel Quintanilla has said that he or she, I'm not sure which, I think it's she, has signed the FIRE letter. So please, if you would put up a link into the chat, and we'll be sure. And she has just done it in the chat. So there we are.
Great. Thank you.
So here's the opportunity for everyone in on this call to actually work to shame these people into maybe reflecting on what they have done. Okay, so back to the Q&A. Let's see here. Someone asks whether your colleagues in foreign countries have faced the same kinds of challenges that anthropologists here in North America have been.
Well, I don't think that all places have the issue, but definitely Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all are dealing with similar issues, possibly even worse. Their situations are possibly even worse. I know from my connection with History Reclaimed that the UK is also dealing with many of these issues along the lines of museum repatriations, and I've written about those issues quite a lot. So I do think in the English-speaking world, it's Europe. They've had repatriations as well of materials from other countries, right? So that is like the Benin bronzes. So I do think that it is further afield than just the US and even than just Canada. South America may be a different story, but one of the things is, and maybe this has changed, so I don't, but one of the things is that for a long time, when you did research like in South America or Mexico, the collections also would be housed in the States. So where there's the infrastructure and so forth. So I don't know how the situation is. I mean, there was a horrendous fire in Brazil several years ago. I don't know if anybody remembers that, where the museum, there was a big museum fire in their national museum, and Lucia, the world's oldest Brazilian remains, I think at 11,500 years ago, named after Lucy, the 3.5 million year old Ethiopian find. She was, the skeleton was destroyed by the fire. So infrastructure in other places is an issue when it comes to collections. And so in the past, this was resolved in part by having the collections housed in places where there was the infrastructure. This is no longer possible because of the repatriation movement around the world and the decolonizing the museum movement.
Yeah. Do you think that there's room for schism in the anthropological associations? And it seems like the American Anthropological Association is pretty firmly captured by this, and as you say, they doubled down on this ridiculous thing. What are the prospects, do you think, of forming an alternative anthropological association? And this is related to one of Jack Butney's comments, namely, is there a possibility to conduct anthropological investigations outside of the circle of doubters and anti-scientists?
Considering that this is like the third anthropological association that has either deplatformed me, kept me out, or canceled me, I don't have a lot of hope. The first one being the Society for American Archaeology, the second one being the California Society of Archaeology, and now the American Anthropological Association. Going to another organization probably wouldn't resolve the issue. Starting a new one, that might be possible. I'm not sure of what it would, I'm not sure that the resources would be there to get it up the ground in a way that would actually benefit the next generation, which is really what you want to do, is have it benefit the next generation. The other aspect of anthropology, which is very different, physical anthropology especially, which is very different than a lot of the fields that are facing these issues, is that we need our materials, right? So we need like the skeletal collections, the artifacts to do research. And I don't see how that's easily solvable when the collections are being reburied. Once they're gone, they're gone. And people who say, oh, well, take x-rays or create 3D bones, which I've been told to do. And I said, it won't matter. They'll come for those too. And they will. So I cannot currently see that there would be an easy way or a possible way to start a new group and have the resources that we need. I think perhaps the better way is to try to fight the reburial and repatriation laws on their unconstitutionality. And I'm working on that with also with the help of Jim Springer, who's far more knowledgeable about the legal aspect. But I think that is the battle to undertake, to say, look, this is not a constitutional law because it breaks the First Amendment of separation of church and state, maybe has other issues as well about seizure of property.
Yeah. Larry in the chat box has a suggestion. You could ask Elon Musk to kick in support for a new anthropological association, and you just might do it. You never know.
Yes.
Okay, so Sandy Childress raises an interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure what she means by this. I hope you'll clarify what you say, Sandy. Attacks of faunal analysis are already here. And by fauna, I'm presuming those are fauna different from the human remains. Does that ring a bell to you?
Yes,
Can
yeah.
you enlighten us? Excellent.
So faunal analysis are usually considered non-human animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she is right that attacks on the preservation of non-human remains are also already here. The big story, not even a year ago, was when P22, which was a puma in the Southern California, who was being tracked over time as an urban puma, urban mountain lion, when P22 died. And I can't remember how P22 died, but because he was tagged, they were able to find the remains, and scientists wanted to study those remains. And immediately Native American tribes said, no, you can't study those remains because this is the ancient one, and we want to give P22 a traditional Indian burial for a puma.
I hope they
What
didn't name it
is a
P22.
burial for a mountain lion? I
Yeah.
cannot imagine that the
Yeah.
Native Americans of 500 years ago were finding mountain lion carcasses and burying them. I just don't believe it.
Yeah.
So yes, the other aspect is one of my requests to the university when they locked me out of the collections was, I could rebuild my research agenda 3 ways. One was a Carthage collection, which is very poorly preserved, and I knew that I would not be able to do a lot of research on it, but that I would have a crack at it, and I did. And I have 2 articles on Carthage, and I presented some talks on it. I said the other thing is X-rays. The collection housed at San Jose State, they took hundreds of X-rays. One of my expertise is in reading X-rays, but they said, no, you can't have the X-rays, those are sacred. The definition of sacred in reburial laws is basically that that the objects were required to do the ritual, the religious ritual. Well, they could not have been required to do any Native American ritual because they didn't have X-rays. It's ridiculous. And then I said, the other thing I can use is one branch of my research has been bone biology. And so I said, I could look at non-human remains to do research. And so they basically said that non-human remains were sacred as well. Now, non-human remains that are considered funerary objects, so let's think of like a bird bone that has been made into a whistle, right? I didn't ask for. I asked for literally the refuse, their dinner bones, right? And that was off the table too. And so right now, basically everything is it's the everything back movement. And I think that that movement is intended to kill off anthropology, physical anthropology. I don't see why I can't imagine that there is a real legitimate concern over these issues from a religious perspective.
Yeah. The issue of X-rays being sacred, I'm reminded of, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but, telephone horoscopes, it's the same thing, there's nothing about the telephone that makes a horoscope special or anything like that. And I'm having a hard time fathoming the reasoning that's going into these people's heads. But this does bring up a question that Larry had posted, which I lost. He's reposted. Thank you, Larry, for doing that. It's related to what Frances Widdowson has mentioned. And of course, activism costs money. You have to pay people, you have to rent places, you have to take out advertising and things like that. And part of the issue is where's the money coming from? And of course, as you know, Frances has said that rent seeking is a big part of it. That the only reason that these people can exist or these activities can exist is that someone is channeling, a lot of money into supporting those activities. And the more money you channel in, the more people decide to try to get in on the game and skim some things off. So what kinds of finances and resources are coming through this, say, for example, everything back movement? What kinds of under the cover support do they get? Is it coming from government funding?
It's coming from government. Yeah. So it's basically coming from the government. There are Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA grants, for example, hiring of repatriation activists. When you have an event, or let's say you have a meeting like a anthropology meeting, and it starts off with Native American groups doing their dance or their song, they get paid for that. So it's coming from us. It's coming from taxpayers, which is also us. So that's where I think a lot of the money's coming from.
Okay, so I guess the bottom line would be that your answer is there's a lot of rent seeking going on in this.
Yeah, I think so.
In this assault against anthropology. Yeah. Okay, so back to the Q&A. Jack Summer has asked, and I think you've answered this question already, Elizabeth. Have you noticed that other disciplines such as sociology and geography have been infected with similar issues of substitution of feelings, in quotes, for evidence for activist ends? And have you found that there are any multidisciplinary activist coalitions that pile on with criticism? So I suppose in your case, it would be coalitions between transgender and Native American activists.
Right. I do think that there are some of those coalitions. I also think like historians and anthropologists coalitions sometimes arise. And also all the ethnic studies groups and anthropologists, right? So those are some of the coalitions I do think arise. Anthropology is probably one of the areas where there's the greatest assault on the scientific endeavors in the field. But sociology and psychology sociology may be worse, and psychology may not be far behind, right? So I don't think that anthropology is unique. I think that it is one of the more problematic ones, but I don't think it's unique in this issue.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly penetrating into fields in the hard sciences as well as into mathematics and things like that. So it's certainly widespread. And again, it's one of these things. I think one of the most amazing phenomena of our time, actually. So Peter McCullough asks another question. He'd like you to clarify something. And he mentions that a decade ago, there was a boycott against certain astronomers were banned from attending a conference in astronomy. And so Peter asks, are you and your colleagues, like-minded colleagues, are you permitted or invited to attend the transitions themed conferences or the conferences to return everything?
You know what? I don't know.
You've never been invited, I guess,
don't know.
I'm guessing.
Basically, the two-paragraph letter that we got, that was all we got. We haven't been given any further information, including that information about whether we will be reimbursed for our registration fees. So I have asked about certain things, but I have not heard from them, and I don't know that any of the panelists have.
Yeah. So, but return everything. When they have a conference, they don't reach out to you to find out your point of view, I'm gathering.
No.
Any others who might disagree with you but still want to hear from you?
I don't know. I suspect that if we went, we would just be ostracized. I suspect that if we tried to give our talks, we'd be kicked out.
Mhm.
Probably with security. There's always security at the events.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
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 And ironically, the our panel was already in a very unfavorable slot, a Sunday afternoon.
Mhm.
So had we been there, I probably would have been a very small audience,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Are there plans to hold an alternate panel discussion like what happened with Dorian Abbott? I mean, when he was canceled out of MIT, they just organized something in another venue, and it was actually pretty well attended, I think.
I've thought about that, and I don't think we will.
Yeah.
The main reason is it's 6 of us, and we're all coming from very different places. And I think it would be, I mean, we could do Zoom, but I think that, you know, we've all talked in some way or other about our cases on Zoom, or about our preference, our research on Zoom. So it hasn't been really floated as an idea.
Mhm.
I mean, we have one person who's from Spain, another
Yeah.
from the UK, one from Quebec, and one from Alberta, and then me, and one Massachusetts. So,
Mhm.
you know, it would be quite an endeavor to pull something off in person.
Yeah. 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 Okay.
And yeah, sorry,
Mhm.
one more thing is like, yeah, I
Okay.
think that if we did do this, we couldn't, you know, I don't think that anybody would get funding from their university.
Yeah. Yeah, to try to do all that travel. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Just coming back to P22, Vicky Galbraith offers some interesting context from the case of that cat. P22 was euthanized on December 17th, 2022, after examinations revealed he was suffering from traumatic injuries consisted of being hit by a car. So, you know,
Yeah.
that provides some interesting context to that.
Thank you.
Peter McCullough goes on to ask if you can provide some more details about this joint conference that was coming. Do you have any idea how many attendees were coming? What was the international
It's a
scope of
huge
it?
conference.
Is it?
It's a
Okay.
huge conference. It's like 900 sessions,
Wow.
runs from like Wednesday to Sunday. It's hybrid, so it's in person and
Yeah.
online. It is the flagship conference for anthropology in the US, and the Canadian Anthropology Society in Canada. So it you know, it is the anthropology conference for the multi-field. There's other conferences that are more specific to physical anthropology or archaeology, or, you know, but this one is 4 fields, and it is I think, if I'm not wrong, they have 900 sessions.
Wow.
Yeah, so
that is big. Whew. That is huge. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so John Lang asks, and he prefaces his question with saying that it's going to be hard to answer. So he's asking you to speculate. And here's his question. Do you think that the extreme irrationality that is upending science may lead to such dysfunctionality in the sciences that rationality will once again unavoidably emerge? I think he's saying
yes, the pendulum may swing the other way. I'm
yes,
hoping.
yes.
I do hope that, and in some ways, this current cancellation, I think, has some of that effect, because the whole aspect of, you know, there is no such thing as biological sex, and what they want to basically do is they'll deny that that's what they're saying, but basically they want to meld gender and sex together. And when you meld gender and sex together, you get rid of sex, not gender, because nobody's getting rid of gender.
No.
So and so I do think that this is like one of the big things, like, well, what about, you know, how is this going to then play out in medicine, and how is this going to play out in other fields? I also think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I also think that the trans issue, especially when you're talking about transitioning children, is going to have a big backlash. I think there's going to be a lot of medical harm done to these children. It has already been done to these children. And so that is going to, I do think that might be the time when people will say, hold on, this all started with, identity politics. It was one aspect of it, but it was a big aspect of it. And therefore, we need to go back and focus on, for people's lives, on individual merit, and for science on facts.
Yeah, well, certainly the issue of mutilating kids, that's going to have a kind of broader constituency against that, I think.
Right.
Compared to our concerns about science, I think the public generally thinks that science is good and we don't really need to worry about what's going on there. So I wonder whether it's going to get the same kind of grassroots attention that you mentioned for the transgender issue, where there's actual harm to children being done in its
hopefully
name.
that those concerns will trickle down to academia.
Well, in hopes, and certainly, the point of the story there is the extreme cost of sending your kids to college there. But just to mention the fire petition again, this is one place where pressure can be brought to bear, and it may be that you have to actually involve not only the leadership of these associations, but maybe since it is a lot of taxpayer dollars involved, maybe to your individual congressman as well, because it, from my perspective, and certainly you've lived through it, Elizabeth, the degradation of the sciences is outrageous, and it's being delivered by deliberate action on the part of people who really are kind of in it for, as Francis Widdowson has said, the rent that they'll be able to skim off. Okay, well, we're approaching the end of our time, and so again, please, if we did not get to your question, or if for some reason it was lost, or we didn't answer it adequately, please do email me your questions at my email address here, the National Association of Scholars. My email address is turner@nas.org. And so please send them along to me, and I'll do my best to get them to Elizabeth so that she can offer her own perspectives on this. And once again, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd just like to put in a very brief plug for Restoring the Sciences. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a very interesting philosopher of science. He's going to be talking about some issues that are related to issues that we brought up today about culture and so forth. His name is Benedict Beckeld. He's a philosopher who's been thinking a lot about what he calls oikophobia. That is the fear of one's own, or the self-loathing of one's own culture. And so do pay attention to the NAS website. We post those things on the website there, and the announcement for that will be coming up soon. And this webinar series is sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. If you're already a member of the National Association of Scholars, thank you very much for the support that you've given us. I should mention that Elizabeth is a member of our board, and welcome to our board, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
If you're not a member and you enjoyed this, do consider joining us, because it's a pretty good group, and I would just invite your support. Okay.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. And I'll leave any final thoughts to you, Elizabeth.
But I just want to say, even though sometimes it seems like, very hopeless, anthropology and many of the sciences, they are worth saving. So we have to try. our hardest. I'm not done fighting for anthropology. And I just hope that some progress is made.
Well, on that hopeful note, I will say thank you again, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. And until